Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Virtual Ninja Show. My name is Javier Soriano, and today we're going to be talking about SIEM migration. And for that, I have my friend and colleague, Prateek Taneja from the engineering team. Hi, Prateek. Please introduce yourself.
Hi, Javier. Thank you for having me. Excited to be here. I am a senior product manager with the Microsoft Sentinel product group. Um, my team and I have been working on the SIEM migration experience and excited to talk about it.
Awesome. Great to have you here, Prateek. And I think the first question is pretty obvious, right? So why SIEM migration? What is important why is it important to customers, and why should customers care about the migration tool that we have built?
With the feature sets that we've been delivering, our focus has always been on accelerating adoption and helping customers adopt and use our features or capabilities in the best way possible. And SIEM migration is basically an extension to that school of thought. Migrations are hard. There is a lot of decisions. There's a whole Pandora's box of decisions that needs to be taken when customers are migrating from one SIEM to another. And these decisions are not always technical. There's also a process-oriented, decision tree that customers need to follow. We found an opportunity where we can try and help this, or we can try and make this easier for customers. And imagine these are two different platforms, right? Fundamentally very different, architecturally very different. So the decisions can range from, well, how do I start monitoring the host of thousands of applications that I have within the enterprise, to how do I start migrating really? So the planning, the execution, um, it's hard. We wanted to make this easier for customers, so customers get their get the best return of investment on making Sentinel their SIEM of choice.
But tell me how. So how did migration tool help customer make this transition easier for them?
Sure, we were talking to customers about their pain points, their journey in general, and the challenges they've faced when migrating between SIEMs. The surveys were, um, you know, we were expecting the responses. The responses basically involved the entire migration journey, which tells you how hard migrations really are. We started in the spirit of prioritization. We started with helping customers or designing the experience that would help customers migrate their detections over to Sentinel, and more specifically, how Splunk customers would translate and migrate their detections over to Sentinel.
But that migration word, Pratik, is really a big word, right? Tell us about how that migration of detections really works, and how do we break it down into different components?
To answer that, let me just oversimplify for a bit. Migration or SIEM systems in general have a similar operating model. The modus operandi, if you will, for all SIEMs is basically first to provide a list of out of the box or a repository of out of the box detections that customers can leverage. And if there are specific needs for customers to build custom detections for specific requirements, um, they use the query language that is supported with the SIEM. So if you're building, say, custom detection in Central, you'll use KQL. If you're building this on Splunk, you'll use the search processing language. But in general, the idea is that this is a two-step process. Choose an out-of-box detection or build your own custom detection. When we were designing the SIEM migration experience, we were mindful and wanted to embed the same two-step process within the experience. So when a customer migrates their detections through the SIEM migration experience, they get a similar value. The detections are first looked at for match or matching with any out-of-the-box detection that Sentinel has to offer. And if we don't find a detection that Sentinel has out of the box that is similar in logic to what is being used in Splunk, we then fall back to what we refer to as translations. These are the custom detections that customers are using in their environment, and these are more often than not crown jewels that customers prefer bringing over to their new scene.
And when you say translation, you mean the actual translation of the query language that is being used in each of the detections? Is that it?
Correct. So if you're migrating from Splunk, detections written in the Splunk SPL or search processing language translated to Kusto query language that Central understands.
But that is quite tough, right? Because I mean, I've seen articles where we have a mapping of commands in SPL, commands in KQL, but there's different subtleties of each of those commands, right? How do we get to have a proper functioning engine that can translate this detection?
I think the most important thing here is how do we get um, more usable and relevant queries. The idea is incorporating the query dependencies and making sure that the context that the customer is using is factored in, right? So again, trying to break down how custom translations happen. Simply put, translations are a mix of two things. One, making sure that the right schema is used when the detections are translated. So if you've started ingesting into Sentinel, the same Splunk source that you were writing detections on, there needs to be some context or there needs to be a mapping on how this maps to a Sentinel table. So a Splunk source mapping to a Sentinel table with the corresponding fields. The second thing is, or the second layer to that is how do operators translate from one language to the other and the way they operate in. There are operators that are used in Splunk in some way. There are corresponding operators in KQL that needs to be used in the right way for the detection logic to be retained. I will take this opportunity to mention or to surface the fact that there practically isn't and cannot be complete operator level parity because these two languages operate on two very distinct platforms.
Super interesting about the comparison between indexes and tables. I didn't think about that we have to understand both to be able to translate. So that's super interesting. Going back to operators, can you give us an example so we better understand, me and the audience, how this works or how the different subtleties around operators come into play?
For sure. Take Splunk, for example. So Splunk has an operator called send email, which would basically, when used within an SPL query, is able to send emails. Of course, it takes parameters such as the title of the email, the recipient and the sender, the body, etc. So everything that is required to compose an email and then actually send the email from the query. Now, in the Sentinel world, or even in the Azure world, KQL operates in a different way. KQL queries are read only, so you can read the database from what you're querying, but you cannot generate actions from KQL queries. In the Sentinel world, the same use case can obviously be achieved, but in a different way. You'd possibly write, say, an automation rule that fires a logic app and generates the email. Just trying to emphasize on the fact that these are two different worlds. The use cases can be achieved, but we just need to be mindful that there isn't complete parity and it isn't like for like.
Okay, Pratik, so I can think of another layer of complexity, right? Which is things like watch lists and parsers and functions and things like that. How do we deal with that in this rule translation?
So yes, now we're talking about the depth of translations and making the queries more and more contextual and usable and relevant for customers. And queries are basically incomplete if these dependencies are not accounted for. When we were speaking to customers, a couple of these Splunk dependencies stood out: Splunk macros and lookups. Macros conceptually are very similar to how we use parsers in Sentinel. So these are reusable pieces of code when referenced within the queries, are replaced with the definition. Um, but in practice, macros are different than parsers. Macros are not syntactically bound. So a string could be a macro definition, and when called within the query, it's just replaced and it works. Parsers, on the other hand, are very syntactically bound. So parsers are host of functions that are expected to be in a specific format. Similarly, there are Splunk lookups, which in theory are conceptually very similar to Sentinel watch list. Both of these are external tables that can be used within queries for looking up data that is stored within these tables. And when these operate, they're very similar to querying a key value pair. Now, when we were designing the experience, how we're addressing these dependencies within the experience is for macros, we're making inline replacements before translations. So we get all context for macros, we make replacements, and then the entire expanded query with the macro definition is then translated from SPL to KQL. For lookups, it's basically mapping. So we allow for a screen space that we'll see in the demo. There's dedicated space where you can map your Splunk lookups to central watch lists along with the fields that are being queried, and all of this is then accounted for when the translation actually happens. So all of this accounted for, all of this considered, the translation has more depth. with the schema being accounted for, the operator translations happening in the right way, the macros and the lookups, all of them being that are used within the SPL query are also sort of brought over or ported over to the KQL query when it's brought to Sentinel.
Awesome, Prateek. Thanks for the great explanations. I think we have now a good understanding of the SIEM migration tool. Why don't we see it in action?
Sure. I'm on the Azure portal and opened a Microsoft Sentinel workspace. I will navigate to content management, go to Content Hub, and I see SIEM migration here. So this is the entry point for SIEM migration. Clicking on it gets me into the goodness. The prerequisites are to ensure that there is more success with the migration execution. Of course, you need to have a Splunk instance that you can export from. Analytic rules require data to be present within the workspace in the specific tables that will be queried. So ensuring data is available, make sure that analytic rules can be enabled. Data availability in general is important for you as a customer to be able to test these rules. So whether it's exporting historical data, making sure that a Sentinel table has it, or initiating new ingestion pipelines via data connectors is another way to go about it. Having data is important. The fourth one here is access requirements. So make sure that on Azure, whoever is performing or executing the migration has at least the central contributor access. And on Splunk, all we need is a Splunk admin to be able to generate a detection export that can be used as an import to the experience.
Pratik, before we move to the next step, one question that I've heard from customers before, do we support Splunk Enterprise as well as Splunk Cloud deployment?
Yes, the experience is agnostic to whether the customer is using Splunk Enterprise or Splunk Cloud. I'll click on Next. The instructions here are basically to export the detections from Splunk. And for somebody who's been operating on Splunk, this should be a piece of cake. We have provided a query for reference that generates a list or the entire detection inventory that is available for the customer on Splunk. But of course, if somebody understands KQL better, they can scope it down and then generate multiple exports. Once the export is available, it needs to be saved as a JSON, which can be imported right in the experience here. For the purpose of the demo, I will go about importing a demo file that I have. The next is schema mappings. So the schema mappings at the time we're recording this is in private preview. Very shortly, it will be available to customers. But what this does is something that we discussed earlier. It allows a space for the customer to give context of how their Splunk sources would map to Sentinel tables. What it does is when I submitted the upload of the query detections, it parsed all the queries and it tried to extract a list of all the sources in Splunk that are being queried. It generates that list that's available right here. What I can do here is review all the sources and how they're mapped in Sentinel. You'll see some of them as auto-mapped. We've tried to make this process as easy as possible for customers. So if there is a known Splunk source, primarily a Splunk common information model or a Splunk SIEM schema that we know maps to a Sentinel normalized or a Sentinel ASIM schema, we've pre-mapped it for our customers to make it easy. So you'll see whatever is available as pre-mapped as auto-mapped. Whatever is custom and more relevant or more contextual to the customer is available as as not mapped. So I'll go about showing how the mapping can happen. So I'll click on syslog, and on the right hand side, you'll see a pane open where there is space for the customer to be able to map their Splunk and Sentinel sources. So the Splunk source is the LHS, the RHS remains Sentinel, and I can go about entering the syslog. This one is easy, but a customer can select from the dropdown. So the list of tables that are existing in the specific workspace are listed, and the customer can go about selecting the table that's most relevant. You see the second layer in the hierarchy. So the Splunk fields can now be mapped to Sentinel fields. I'll quickly map a couple of fields here. Assignment, probably to computer.
It is awesome, by the way. Wow. Very customizable. Nice.
Yep. The idea is to make it more and more easy for customers. And to that extent, what we've done is save this mapping on a workspace level. So once the mapping is done for a specific source, it is saved within the context of that workspace. So when you exit and you come back to the experience, you don't have to remap, right? So this is
Got it.
sources. There is a possibility that our parsing has not been able to identify a specific source. And in that case, we also have an option for a customer to be able to add a source that they feel they are using in the query, but the experience hasn't been able to list it in the page here. So when you click on add source, there is an option for the customer to add the source that they wish to and map it to the central table that they're ingesting the source. And I'll just select something at random. And then you can go about adding the field level mapping. So you add field one, and then you map it to a specific field within that table. I'll cancel it for now.
Would I also overwrite one of the auto mapped sources?
Absolutely, absolutely. This is to give the customers a starting point, and it can be overwritten. So if I click on one of the auto mapped, it will show me how the field mappings exist, and I can go about selecting and changing this mapping.
Fantastic.
And this is for sources. In addition to data sources, we also have a space to map the lookups. So similar logic, we parse the queries, we identify all the lookups that are being used within these SPL queries and list them here. The mapping experience remains similar. So if I click on one of these, I can select the watch lists from my workspace. Again, this is the logical boundary here is the workspace that you're operating out of, and I can go about selecting the mappings for the fields. Click Save Changes, it maps. Now, the idea here is once the customer provides the context in terms of data source mappings and lookups, when we get to translation, so when I click on Configure Rules and the translations actually start, all of the mappings that were provided should be taken account into translation. So the queries now that will be generated will be more contextual, will be more relevant, will have all the dependencies accounted for. You'll see on this page, we first see a pre-migration summary. So it gives you a summary of how many rules were uploaded. We discussed about out-of-the-box matching. So if you see a translation type as out of the box, it basically means that we have been able to find a central out-of-the-box detection that mapped to a Splunk out-of-the-box detections. If we did not find anything that maps to an out-of-the-box detection, it's tagged as custom. And the same is available in the pre-migration summary. And this is to give an executive overview of the amount of effort that will be required with the migration, and it's exportable. When clicking on export summary, it just downloads the same summary, which can be saved as reference. Coming to translation state, we discussed how translation is schemas plus operators, SPL to KQL. Translation state gives the customer a visibility on how successful the SIEM migration experience was with translating. Out of the box are translated as is because we have a KQL query that is available with the out of the box detection. For custom, we have been able to fully translate or partially translate the SPL to KQL. What's also available here is for customers to be able to edit the query that was generated. So if you're not happy with the translation, or if you want to further tune this, it can all be done right here. So I can add my custom logic and I can save the changes right here. And that changes the translation state to manually translated. What you'll also notice is the toggle button to deploy. And this is a way that customers would select the scope of translation. Anything that's fully translated, we try to scope it in for translation so they're toggled on by default, and so is manually translated. So if a customer has edited a query and it's manually translated, the deploy scope is toggled to on by default. Anything that's partially translated is not turned on by default, but it's up to the customer to bring it into scope. So I can select multiple, and that brings it into deployment in the central workspace. The next step here is review and migrate. Also re-emphasizing the fact that we try to bring in as much context from the Splunk query as possible. So when we're translating, we also make sure that the configuration parameters with queries, the trigger frequency, the query frequency, the query lookback period, all of that is retained as much as possible, and it's factored into when the KQL friendly or the KQL version of the detection is deployed in Central. When I get to review and migrate, this is where I would start the deployment. But before I start the deployment, I can export these templates as ARM templates. We heard from customers that they prefer a non-UI based deployment, which is why we added the option to export templates, which customers can use to plug into their CI/CD pipelines and then deploy via their CI/CD processes. Clicking on deploy here basically starts the deployment of all the scoped in detections.
That's awesome, Pratik. Like detection migration in 1 minute. There you go.
Right. So the deployment of these analytic rules is now complete, and you'll see the download migration summary option is now available, which basically downloads the execution of the current migration. Again, this is important for reporting or in general maintaining the progress of migration. So, what was migrated and what was the status of each and every rule that was migrated. In addition, all of these rules are now deployed as active rules. With the active rules, what we also do is anytime there's an out of the box match, we also deploy the corresponding solutions because out of the box detections leverage dependencies in terms of parsers and data connectors. So we want to make this process as streamlined, as easy for customers. So we deploy the solution, we also make the template available, and we also deploy the active rule. So I'll now navigate back to Microsoft Sentinel and open Analytics. And you'll notice all of these rules that we just migrated are available with the prefix called Splunk migrated. We specifically added this so customers can identify between the detections that were migrated using the migration experience and the detections that they're building. So there's proper discovery, proper separation, and they can also filter these detections out. These are deployed in a disabled state by default because we don't want to create churn for customers immediately on deployment. So this is, the final step in enabling these detections so customers can review what is deployed and then enable them either one by one or just select everything and click on enable.
Yeah, that looks great. And it makes a lot of sense what you mentioned about installing the Content Hub solution that comes with these rules, right? Because the customer might be able to benefit from additional stuff in that solution, right? Like a workbook or a parser or some hunting queries. So yeah, that's great to see that we're adding the complete picture of the solution.
Absolutely. The whole package now becomes available.
Awesome demo, Pratik. Great to see this functioning. So can you tell us what's next for the SIEM migration tool?
So I'm glad you asked, Javier. In the short term, we want to continue investing in increasing the accuracy of our translations. So these translations are more and more valuable and usable for customers. So it's plug and play. We are aware and cognizant of the fact that at this point we're only serving or we're only um, adding value on part of the migration. Customers treat migration as a bigger adoption journey, and we want to alleviate customers of the technical and the procedural challenges that we earlier spoke about. The experience will continue to grow. We want customers to adopt Central and the unified security operations platform as fast as possible, and with minimum hurdles, so that they're able to not just bring in their detections, migrate what they term or they look at as crown jewels, but they're also able to leverage value from what we have out of the box and also optimize it. There's also opportunity to add in experiences as a co-migrator with generative AI and security co-pilot. So lots of exciting stuff is happening.
So thanks, Pratik. Looking forward to see those innovations in the product. And thank you so much for coming to the show and telling us about this new SIEM migration experience. Thank you everyone for watching. See you next time.